The story moves quietly through the distant past, following the slow emergence of human beliefs about life beyond death, tracing how tombs were shaped, how paths were imagined for unseen journeys, and how the idea of an afterlife settled gently into human thought. Long before written memory, before fixed calendars or measured hours, human life unfolded within landscapes that seemed endless and patient. Forests breathed softly in the early morning, plains shimmered under pale light, and rivers moved with steady persistence toward unseen horizons. In these spaces, generations lived and faded without leaving names behind, known only through the faint marks of their hands and the quiet traces of their habits. Life followed the rhythms of weather and season, shaped by sunrise and dusk, by hunger and rest, by warmth and cold. Death, when it arrived, did not announce itself loudly. It appeared as a slowing, a stillness, a quiet absence where movement had once been. The body cooled beneath open skies or dim shelters, and those who remained stood nearby, uncertain but attentive. In this stillness, early humans began to sense that something had changed, but had not entirely vanished. The body remained, yet the presence felt altered, as though a familiar current had withdrawn into another channel. Over time, this subtle awareness deepened. The land itself seemed to suggest continuity rather than endings. The sun disappeared each evening only to return. Seeds vanished into soil and rose again as green shoots. Footprints faded, yet paths remained. Within such patterns, it became natural to wonder whether life followed a similar rhythm, whether death was not an erasure, but a passage. Slowly, across many regions and centuries, the idea took shape that something of a person continued onward, moving along unseen routes, traveling paths that could not be followed with the eyes alone. In the earliest settled rhythms of human life, mornings arrived without announcement. Pale light slid gradually across the ground, revealing forms that had never truly disappeared during the night. The gentle curve of shelter walls shaped from earth and branch, the shallow impressions of bare feet pressed into packed soil, the quiet silhouettes of tools resting where they had last been used. Cool air lingered close to the surface, carrying the faint scent of smoke and damp grass. Breath rose softly as people stirred, and the world awakened without urgency, guided by habit rather than intention. Life did not begin sharply at dawn. It unfolded slowly, easing forward with the same patience shown by the land itself. Daily movement followed patterns shaped by repetition instead of instruction. Hands reached instinctively toward familiar work, knowing weight and texture without conscious thought. Fibers were drawn together and twisted with steady fingers. Stones were lifted and struck with measured precision, and food was prepared in calm sequences that had changed little over time. These actions were neither rushed nor dramatic. They filled the day quietly, forming a dependable structure that softened uncertainty. Within this rhythm, each individual presence mattered. Every person occupied a place that was felt deeply, even if it was rarely spoken aloud. Time itself seemed broader and less divided. There was no strict need to separate moments or measure progress closely. Tasks concluded when they were complete, not when a signal demanded it. This unhurried flow allowed attention to settle naturally on the surrounding world. Subtle changes were noticed and remembered. The way shadows shortened across the ground, the shift in birdsong before rain, the gradual ripening of fruit over many days. Observation became a shared skill, refined slowly through living close to the same landscape across generations. Within this attentiveness, the fragile balance of life was always present, though rarely confronted directly. Strength ebbed and returned, energy rose and faded, and the body followed rhythms as quiet as the land. When fatigue or illness appeared, it did so gently, marked first by small changes in movement or breath. The group adjusted without comment. Work was redistributed, voices softened, and care took the form of simple, steady gestures. These moments revealed how closely bound the community was, and how naturally attention turned toward preserving balance rather than resistant change. As evening approached, activity slowed further. Fires were tended with unhurried hands, coaxed rather than forced. Smoke rose in thin, wavering lines, dissolving into darkening air. The day closed without ceremony, and rest arrived gradually. In this steady cycle of waking and sleeping, working and pausing, early humans lived within a world that felt continuous and enduring. Against this backdrop of calm repetition, the first quiet questions about absence and presence began to form, not as sudden realizations, but as gentle thoughts shaped by long familiarity with the rhythms of living and the certainty of change. Within these steady patterns of living, moments of weakness were absorbed into the rhythm rather than standing apart from it. When a body grew tired more quickly than before, or when breath became shallow and uneven, the change was noticed without alarm. Movement slowed, and familiar tasks were taken up by others as naturally as a shifting wind alters the direction of smoke. Care emerged through ordinary actions. Water was brought, shade was adjusted, warmth was shared. No sharp line separated labor from tending. Both belonged to the same quiet obligation of continuity. As strength faded further, attention gathered gently around the resting of figure. The body remained within the flow of daily life, close to the hearth and the low murmur of voices. This closeness allowed the living to adjust gradually to an approaching absence. Touch confirmed presence, even as responsiveness diminished, and the shared space softened the transition. In this period of stillness, the distinction between the living and the departing felt less defined, as though one state shaded gently into another. When the final breath came, it did not interrupt the world. Light continued to move across surfaces, and the familiar sounds of wind and insects persisted. Yet within the small human circle, motion paused briefly. The body lay quiet, altered in subtle but unmistakable ways. Warmth slowly withdrew, and the weight of limbs changed. Those nearby observed this transformation with patient attention, learning through experience that something essential had departed, even though the physical form remained. The body was treated with care rather than haste. It was cleaned, arranged, and covered in ways that reflected everyday habits of order and respect. These actions were practical, but they also carried meaning shaped by repetition. The positioning of limbs, the smoothing of coverings, and the placement of familiar objects echoed the routines of life. In maintaining these gestures after death, the living expressed an unspoken sense that the person's identity was not extinguished, only altered. For a time, the body remained among the living. This lingering allowed adjustment and acknowledgement without urgency. The presence of the departed continued to shape movement and conversation, not through fear or awe, but through familiarity. Memory surfaced naturally, carried by the sight of tools or the sound of routines once shared. In this quiet interval, the idea that life might extend beyond visible motion began to settle more firmly, shaped less by imagination than by the steady refusal of memory to fade. As the moment approached to place the body beyond the space of daily living, the act was approached with deliberation. The choice of where and how to rest the body reflected careful thought, guided by landscape, habit, and feeling. This transition marked a subtle shift in understanding. The living began to recognize that death required its own forms of care, its own rhythms, and its own places within the world. Through these early practices, the foundation was laid for the belief that departure did not mean disappearance, but movement along a quieter, unseen path. When the time came to place the body beyond the immediate space of daily living, the movement outward was slow and considered. The chosen place was rarely accidental. It might lie at the edge of a clearing, beneath a familiar tree, along a gently sloping hill, or near water that moved steadily without disturbance. Such locations felt appropriate not because they were hidden, but because they endured. The land itself seemed capable of holding memory without effort, and in entrusting the dead to these places, the living expressed confidence in the landscape's quiet constancy. The journey to this resting place followed paths already known. Feet moved along routes shaped by repeated passage, and the body was carried with steady care. No sharp division separated this act from other movements across the land. It resembled the transport of gathered food or crafted tools, conducted with the same calm attentiveness. Yet within the ordinary motion, a subtle weight was felt. The body no longer participated, and this difference sharpened awareness of absence, even as familiarity softened its edges. At the resting place, gestures became more deliberate. Earth was cleared, stones were gathered, and surfaces were smoothed by hand. The body was placed gently, aligned according to habit or instinct, sometimes facing the rising sun, sometimes turned toward a well-known landmark. These orientations were not dictated by fixed doctrine. They emerged gradually from shared feeling and repetition. Over time, such choices gained quiet authority, becoming customary without ever needing explanation. Objects accompanied the body in modest number. They were items drawn from daily life, a tool worn smooth by use, a vessel shaped by familiar hands, a piece of cloth bearing the scent of smoke and home. These were not offerings made in fear or display. They were gestures of continuity, reflecting an assumption that the rhythms of life might persist in altered form. In leaving these objects behind, the living acknowledged that the relationship with the departed did not end abruptly at the edge of the grave. Afterward, the place was marked. Sometimes this took the form of a small mound, carefully shaped and pressed smooth. In other cases, stones were stacked into low cairns, each piece selected and placed with intention. Wood might be used where stone was scarce, forming frames or coverings that slowly returned to the earth. These markers were not meant to dominate the landscape. They settled into it, becoming part of the terrain rather than standing apart from it. Returning to daily life after these acts did not require a sudden shift. Work resumed gradually, conversation returned softly, and routines reasserted themselves without force. Yet the presence of the resting place lingered in awareness. Paths now curved around it, glances fell upon it in passing, and small pauses marked its recognition. Through these repeated acknowledgments, the living wove absence into the fabric of everyday movement. Over seasons, such places accumulated meaning. Visits became habitual, prompted by changing weather or the turning of the year. The markers weathered and were renewed. In maintaining them, the living reaffirmed connection. Death, in this way, did not remove individuals entirely from the community. Instead, it shifted their presence into a quieter register, one that coexisted with daily life and subtly reshaped how continuity was understood. As time passed, the presence of these resting places settled naturally into the mental landscape of the living. They were not regarded as distant or forbidden spaces, but as familiar points woven into daily movement. Children learned their locations early, guided along paths that curved gently past low mounds or clusters of stones. Small gestures accompanied these passages: a brief pause, a lowered voice, the quiet straightening of a marker disturbed by weather. Through repetition, respect became instinctive rather than taught. Seasonal rhythms reinforced this connection. At certain times of year, when light shifted or temperatures softened, visits occurred more frequently. Food was carried and set down briefly, not as an offering to unseen powers, but as an echo of shared routines. The act mirrored the simple hospitality extended to the living. In this way, the dead remained participants in the cycle of communal life, acknowledged through actions that required no elaborate explanation. Stories began to gather around these places, though they remained restrained and practical. They recalled where someone had once worked, the path they favored, the tools they had shaped. These memories were passed on quietly, often while walking or working, so that remembrance became part of movement rather than a separate event. The landscape itself helped preserve these narratives. A stone near a resting place or a bend in a path served as a prompt, allowing memory to surface without effort. Over generations, the accumulation of such sites subtly altered how space was perceived. Land was no longer only a resource for survival, it became a record of passage. Each resting place marked a point where life had shifted rather than ended. The idea that movement continued beyond visible activity grew stronger, reinforced by the consistent return to these markers and the enduring presence they suggested. This understanding did not require abstraction or doctrine. It emerged from habit, observation, and care repeated over long periods. The dead were neither distant nor omnipresent. They occupied a quiet middle ground, connected to the living through place and practice. Paths taken for practical reasons became layered with meaning, serving both as routes of daily labor and as symbolic passages between states of being. By folding death gently into everyday geography, early communities developed a sense of continuity that softened fear and uncertainty. Absence was acknowledged without rupture, and memory was sustained through ordinary acts. In this way, the earliest foundations were laid for the belief that life extended beyond its visible limits, traveling along unseen paths that paralleled those walked each day by the living. From these quiet arrangements of daily life and gentle care for the dead, attention slowly widened beyond the familiar circle of kin and routine. As generations passed, certain individuals came to occupy a distinct place within communal memory. These were not figures elevated by sudden power or dramatic acts, but people whose presence had been steady and formative over many years. Their names lingered longer in conversation, attached to paths, tools, and practices that endured after their passing. In remembering them, communities began to sense that some lives left deeper impressions on the flow of time than others. Such individuals were often elders whose long experience shaped collective decisions. They understood the land intimately, recalling seasons of scarcity and abundance, knowing when rivers would swell and when game would migrate. Their guidance was rarely issued as command. Instead, it emerged through quiet suggestion, offered while working side by side or resting near the fire. Over time, this accumulated knowledge gave them a subtle authority, rooted not in force, but in trust. When they spoke, attention gathered naturally. When one of these figures approached death, the change was felt early. Movement slowed more noticeably, speech shortened, and tasks once performed without effort were gradually set aside. Others stepped in without ceremony, aware that the knowledge carried by this person could not be easily replaced. Time spent nearby increased, not from urgency, but from an unspoken recognition that presence itself mattered. Listening became a form of care, as stories and observations were absorbed with renewed attentiveness. After death, the treatment of such a person followed familiar patterns, yet with added deliberation. The body was placed with particular care, and the resting place was chosen thoughtfully. It might overlook a valley that had sustained many seasons of work, or sit near a path frequently traveled under their guidance. Objects placed beside the body reflected a lifetime of practice, a tool worn smooth by years of use, a staff shaped to fit a familiar hand, a vessel associated with shared meals and counsel. These choices quietly acknowledged the role the individual had played in maintaining balance within the group. The site itself soon took on added meaning. Visits became more frequent, not out of obligation, but because the place offered a sense of continuity. Standing there, people recalled decisions once made, paths once chosen, and lessons learned through experience rather than instruction. The presence of the resting place transformed memory into something anchored and accessible, reinforcing the idea that influence did not end with physical stillness. In this way, biography began to take shape without being named as such. A life was remembered not through written record or formal account, but through repeated association with place and practice. Over time, these memories stabilized into quiet narratives retold in fragments during work or travel. Through them, communities deepened their sense that certain lives continued to shape the present, even after death, and that the afterlife might be understood not only as a distant realm, but as an ongoing presence woven into the living world. As these remembered lives accumulated, patterns emerged that extended beyond any single individual. Communities began to recognize that certain events, decisions, or changes had shaped their collective path in lasting ways. A migration undertaken during difficult seasons, the establishment of a reliable route between water and shelter, the introduction of a new tool or method of preparation. Such moments were recalled not for their drama, but for their endurance. They marked gentle turning points, after which life continued with slightly altered rhythm. These events were often linked to the presence of a particular person or small group whose steadiness had guided the transition. Over time, memory drew these figures into clearer focus. Their actions were retold with careful consistency, not embellished, but preserved through repetition. The language used to recall them remained plain and practical, emphasizing what had been done rather than who had commanded it. In this restraint, the stories retained a quiet authority, grounding belief in familiarity rather than spectacle. When death touched such figures, the community responded with a subtle shift in tone. The acts surrounding their passing carried a measured gravity, expressed through patience rather than display. Preparation took longer. The selection of the resting place was discussed softly, informed by shared recollection. There was an awareness that this placement would become a point of reference for many seasons to come. In choosing it, the living were shaping how memory would persist within the landscape. The act of burial or placement thus took on an additional layer of meaning. It was no longer solely an acknowledgement of personal absence, but also a recognition of continuity across generations. The site marked not only where a body rested, but where decisions and knowledge had once gathered. Over time, paths subtly adjusted to pass near these places, allowing memory to surface during ordinary movement. The living encountered the past not through deliberate pilgrimage, but through daily travel. These encounters encouraged reflection without forcing it. Passing a familiar marker might prompt a brief recollection of advice once given or a solution once found. Such memories did not interrupt work, they accompanied it. In this way, the presence of the dead blended seamlessly into the present, shaping choices quietly rather than asserting authority. The afterlife, as imagined through these practices, was not distant or dramatic. It existed alongside the living, woven into routine and reinforced by place. As years passed, the accumulation of these remembered figures formed a loose lineage of influence. The community's sense of itself deepened, shaped by awareness that its present conditions were the result of many prior lives. Death, within this understanding, did not sever contribution. Instead, it transformed it. The departed continued to participate through memory, guidance, and the enduring marks they left upon the land. Through these experiences, belief in an afterlife gained substance, grounded in the observable persistence of influence long after physical life had ended. With the passing of time, these places of memory began to gather quiet authority. They were no longer only reminders of individual lives, but reference points within a shared understanding of the world. Decisions were sometimes considered in relation to them, measured against what had been done before. When uncertainty arose, people walked familiar routes and found themselves lingering near these sites, allowing recollection to settle thought. The land, shaped by memory, offered guidance without words. Gradually, certain resting places became associated with particular kinds of knowledge. One might be remembered for understanding weather and seasons, another for skill in crafting or negotiation. These associations were not fixed doctrines, but gentle impressions, reinforced through repeated remembrance. The living did not expect answers from the dead, yet they sensed continuity in returning to places where wisdom had once resided. In this way, the afterlife was imagined less as a distant realm and more as an extension of influence, diffused through space and habit. Rituals surrounding these figures remained modest. They did not require elaborate ceremony or rigid schedule. A visit might coincide with a change in season or follow the completion of a task once overseen by the departed. Food might be shared nearby, tools rested briefly against a marker, or a path cleared of encroaching growth. These acts were practical and symbolic at once, reinforcing the idea that memory required maintenance just as land and shelter did. Stories connected to these individuals evolved slowly. Over time, they lost precise detail and gained steadiness. What mattered was not exact chronology, but the consistency of meaning. A lesson learned, a method passed on, a moment of patience remembered. These fragments persisted because they remained useful. In retelling them, the living reinforced a sense of continuity that bridged absence. The past did not feel sealed away. It remained accessible through ordinary movement and speech. As generations overlapped, children grew up knowing these places as part of their world from the beginning. They learned names alongside landmarks, understanding that the ground beneath their feet carried layers of lived experience. This awareness shaped their sense of belonging. Life was understood as something received and continued rather than begun anew each generation. The afterlife, within this framework, became a natural extension of that continuity, a state in which influence endured even when visibility faded. Through these accumulated practices, belief deepened without proclamation. There was no single moment of realization, no clear boundary between observation and conviction. Instead, the idea that life continued beyond death emerged as the most reasonable explanation for the persistence of memory, guidance, and presence felt across time. In honoring those who had shaped the community, the living affirmed that existence did not end abruptly, but shifted into quieter forms that continued to shape the world they inhabited. As these understandings settled more firmly, the distinction between living influence and departed presence softened further. The dead were not imagined as removed from the world, nor as intervening forces. Instead, they occupied a calm, enduring layer of reality, present through memory, place, and pattern. Their influence was felt in the way paths were chosen, tools were shaped, and decisions were weighed against long experience. In this sense, the afterlife was not a separate destination, but a continuation of participation through quieter means. Over time, some resting places became central points in communal orientation. They were used to mark direction, to define boundaries, or to anchor gatherings. The physical presence of these sites lent stability to collective memory. Even as names faded or merged, the sense that many lives had passed through the same ground remained strong. The land became a ledger written without symbols, recording lives through repetition rather than inscription. This continuity encouraged a broader understanding of time. Life was no longer perceived solely as an individual span, bounded by birth and death. It became part of a longer flow, extending backward into ancestry and forward into those yet to come. Each person was seen as a temporary bearer of shared knowledge and practice, responsible for maintaining balance before passing it on. Death, within this view, was not an interruption of purpose, but a change in how purpose was expressed. The treatment of those who died reflected this perspective. Care remained steady and unadorned, guided by habit rather than fear. Placement within the land was chosen to preserve connection, ensuring that the departed remained within the sphere of daily movement. Paths continued to pass nearby, work continued around them, and life adjusted without severing ties. The dead remained companions in the landscape, acknowledged through presence rather than invocation. As generations accumulated, these practices reinforced a shared conviction that existence extended beyond visible action. The afterlife was not imagined in vivid detail. It did not require elaborate descriptions or distant realms. It was understood through continuity, through the enduring influence of those who had lived, worked, and cared within the same spaces. In this quiet understanding, belief found stability. By the close of this long process, the idea of an afterlife had become inseparable from ordinary life itself. It was woven into daily routines, embedded in paths and places, and sustained by memory rather than declaration. Through biography remembered without spectacle, through events recalled without drama, and through landscapes shaped by repeated care, early humans formed a calm and enduring belief that life did not vanish at death, but continued along unseen paths, remaining present in the world through the steady persistence of influence and memory. As memory and biography settled into the landscape, attention gradually turned toward what could not be fully explained through habit alone. The quiet conviction that life continued beyond visible presence invited reflection on how this continuation might unfold. Without urgency or certainty, early communities began to shape ideas around the movement of the self after death, guided by observation, repetition, and the enduring patterns of the natural world. In this way, mystery emerged not as a problem to be solved, but as a space to be gently explored. The land offered familiar metaphors for unseen journeys. Rivers flowed steadily beyond sight, disappearing into bends and reappearing farther on. Paths wound through forests and hills, leaving one clearing only to arrive at another. The sun itself traced a dependable arc, vanishing each evening and returning without fail. These rhythms suggested that disappearance did not equate to ending. Instead, movement continued along routes that could not always be followed directly. Such patterns shaped early reflections on what might happen after death, providing quiet reassurance through analogy rather than argument. Burial practices began to reflect this growing sense of passage. Orientation took on additional meaning, though it remained fluid and regionally shaped. Bodies were sometimes aligned toward sunrise or along the direction of a nearby river's flow. These choices were not governed by rigid doctrine. They emerged gradually, shaped by shared feeling and reinforced through repetition. Over time, alignment became a way of acknowledging direction, suggesting that the departed might be moving onward rather than remaining fixed. Certain routes through the landscape began to carry layered significance. Paths that led away from settlements toward open horizons or high ground felt suitable for imagining transition. These routes were traveled in life and imagined in death, allowing the living to conceive of the afterlife as a continuation of familiar movement. The idea of ghost paths, unseen trails followed by those who had died, grew naturally from this understanding. These paths were not marked by fear. They were quiet extensions of known ways, offering a gentle image of departure that mirrored the rhythms of daily travel. Objects placed with the dead reflected this perspective. Items associated with movement, staffs, sandals, simple tools, appeared alongside the body. These were not symbols of status, but of readiness. They suggested that the journey beyond death required preparation similar to travel in life. Through these modest gestures, belief took form without elaboration. The afterlife was imagined not as a distant, abstract realm, but as a continuation along familiar lines, unfolding gradually beyond the edge of sight. As these ideas took root, They found expression in subtle variations across different landscapes. In river valleys, the steady movement of water became a dominant image for transition. Streams carried leaves and silt away from familiar banks, never returning them in the same form, yet continuing their presence downstream. Communities living beside such waters often placed their dead near the flow, sensing that the current offered guidance. The river was not asked to carry the dead away, but it suggested direction, continuity, and calm persistence beyond sight. In open plains and highlands, the horizon played a similar role. Paths stretched outward, narrowing as they approached distant edges where sky met land. These expanses invited the imagination to move forward rather than downward. Resting places were sometimes oriented toward wide views, allowing the departed to face outward, as if beginning a long and gentle passage. The afterlife, in such settings, was envisioned less as descent and more as gradual departure, marked by openness rather than enclosure. Markers along these imagined routes were understated. Standing stones, low piles of earth, or subtle carvings appeared at intervals, not to announce presence loudly, but to acknowledge transition. These features blended into the terrain, requiring familiarity to notice. Over time, they became reference points in both memory and movement. Passing them in life reminded the living of continuity. Imagining them in death provided reassurance that the path was known and prepared. Archaeological traces reveal that these markers were often renewed. Stones were righted after storms, earth reshaped after erosion. Such maintenance mirrored the care given to paths used daily. In tending these features, the living affirmed that the roots of the dead mattered as much as those of the living. This quiet attention reinforced the belief that movement beyond death was neither chaotic nor solitary, but guided and supported through collective memory. Symbols associated with travel appeared gradually. Simple carvings of footprints, lines suggesting direction, or repeated patterns evoking flow emerged on stones and tools. These images were not decorative in the modern sense. They were functional expressions of understanding, compressing complex ideas into familiar forms. Through them, the concept of passage became tangible, something that could be seen and touched, even if it could not be fully explained. These practices did not produce a single, unified vision of the afterlife. Instead, they allowed many interpretations to coexist. Some imagined a slow journey alongside ancestors. Others envisioned dispersal into the land itself. What united these views was the shared assumption of continuity. Death marked a change in form and movement, not an erasure. Through paths traced in earth and water, belief found a quiet structure, shaped by observation and sustained through gentle repetition. Over time, these imagined routes became less about geography and more about orientation within the world. The afterlife was no longer conceived solely as a destination reached after leaving the body behind, but as a process of transition guided by familiarity. The dead were thought to move gradually away from the sphere of daily activity, following paths that echoed those walked in life. This gradual movement allowed separation to occur without rupture, preserving balance between remembrance and release. Certain moments within the year deepened this sense of passage. Seasonal changes, when the land itself appeared to withdraw or return, offered quiet parallels. Leaves fell and gathered along paths before being carried away by wind and rain. Snow softened familiar routes, obscuring them temporarily before revealing them again. These cycles reinforce the idea that disappearance was often temporary or partial, part of a larger rhythm rather than a final state. Within this understanding, death was folded into the same pattern of retreat and return observed everywhere else. Ritual attention to these cycles remained restrained. There were no grand reenactments of journeys, no elaborate narratives imposed upon the unknown. Instead, meaning accumulated through repeated, modest acts. A path cleared after winter, a marker repaired in spring, a moment of stillness during a seasonal turn. These gestures maintained alignment between the living world and the imagined movement beyond it. In performing them, people affirmed that continuity required care, even when its outcome could not be seen. The concept of the self also shifted subtly. Identity was no longer bound entirely to the visible body. It extended into memory, place, and motion. A person could be absent and still exert presence, could be unseen, and yet remain oriented within the community's understanding of the world. This idea did not require articulation. It was felt through practice, reinforced by the persistent sense that influence did not end where visibility did. Archaeological remains suggest that these beliefs were remarkably durable. Across generations, markers were reused, paths maintained, and orientations preserved. Even as materials changed and details blurred, the underlying structure endured. The dead were consistently imagined as moving onward, guided by familiar signs, supported by collective care. This stability indicates that the belief in continued passage met a deep human need to reconcile change with continuity and loss with enduring connection. By the close of this long, gradual development, mystery had become a settled companion rather than a source of anxiety. The afterlife was not sharply defined, yet it was confidently assumed. It existed in the spaces between observation and imagination, shaped by land, movement, and memory. Through ghost paths traced lightly across the world, early humans found a way to understand death not as an abrupt ending, but as a quiet journey along routes that had always been there, waiting just beyond the edge of sight. As these imagined paths settled into shared understanding, attention drifted further inward, toward the quiet meanings carried by ritual itself. The markers along hillsides and riverbanks were visible, but what they represented reached beyond stone and earth. Gradually, the act of remembering became intertwined with the act of believing. The living began to sense that ritual was not merely a response to death, but a way of maintaining balance between what could be seen and what could only be felt. Rituals remained understated, shaped by repetition rather than decree. A certain way of approaching a resting place, a familiar pause before leaving it behind, or the habit of touching a marker lightly before continuing on a path. These gestures accumulated significance through constancy. They were rarely discussed. Their meaning was carried in the body, learned through observation and imitation rather than explanation. In this way, belief embedded itself within motion and posture, becoming inseparable from daily life. The spaces surrounding burial sites reflected this quiet attentiveness. Ground was kept clear, paths subtly redirected, and vegetation managed just enough to preserve visibility without imposing order. These choices revealed an understanding that the boundary between the living world and the realm beyond was not fixed. It required maintenance, much like any other part of the environment. Care extended outward, ensuring that transition remained gentle and orientation remained possible. Symbols used within these practices were simple and adaptable. Circles traced in soil, repeated lines carved into stone, or arrangements of objects following familiar patterns offered a visual language that suggested continuity. These forms echoed natural cycles, the turning of seasons, the looping of paths, the return of stars to known positions. Through such echoes, ritual connected human experience to larger rhythms, reinforcing the idea that death followed patterns already present in the world. Archaeological traces show that these symbolic gestures were rarely isolated. They appeared alongside practical features, blending utility with meaning. A path served both daily travel and imagined passage. A stone functioned as both marker and seat. This overlap ensured that belief did not drift into abstraction. It remained grounded, reinforced through constant contact with the physical world. Through these quiet practices, the mystery of the afterlife became familiar without being defined. There was no need to describe what lay at the end of the path. What mattered was that the path existed, maintained through shared care and gentle repetition. In honoring transition through ritual woven into everyday movement, early communities found stability in uncertainty, allowing belief to deepen gradually, guided not by fear of the unknown, but by trust in continuity itself. As these quiet rituals and shared understandings settled into the fabric of daily life, differences within the community began to take on clearer form. Not all lives unfolded with the same breadth of responsibility, and not all memories carried equal weight. Over time, certain roles gathered around them a more visible presence, shaping how belief and practice were organized. From the calm continuity of ordinary routines emerged figures whose tasks centered on coordination, mediation, and the careful tending of collective meaning. These individuals were not set apart by spectacle. Their distinction arose gradually through function. Some oversaw the timing of seasonal movements, others guided exchanges between groups, and a few became recognized for their steadiness in moments of uncertainty. Their authority was quiet and situational, grounded in experience rather than proclamation. They spoke little, listened closely, and moved with deliberation. In doing so, they embodied continuity, linking past decisions to present needs without haste. Spaces associated with these roles began to take shape subtly. Certain areas near central paths or gathering places were kept more open, more carefully maintained. Fires burned there longer, and tools rested in deliberate arrangement. These spaces were not separate from daily life, but they drew people together more frequently. Within them, memory and planning overlapped, and discussions unfolded in low, even tones. The presence of such spaces suggested an emerging structure within communal life, one that supported reflection as much as action. When death touched one of these figures, the response reflected their position. Care remained gentle and unadorned, yet attention lingered longer. The choice of resting place was considered carefully, often near routes frequently traveled or sites already layered with memory. The act was not meant to elevate the individual above others, but to preserve accessibility. Their influence, carried through counsel and coordination in life, was allowed to persist through proximity in death. Over time, these resting places became points of quiet orientation. People passed them when gathering or setting out on shared tasks. allowing memory to accompany movement. In this way, social structure and belief intertwined. The presence of leaders, elders, or mediators did not introduce hierarchy through force, but through continuity. Their remembered lives offered stability, reinforcing the sense that order extended beyond individual spans, and that guidance could endure even as bodies stilled. Through these developments, belief in an afterlife began to reflect social form as well as personal experience. The continuation imagined beyond death mirrored the organization emerging within life itself, calm, layered, and sustained through shared responsibility. In this alignment, early institutions took shape quietly, rooted in trust and habit, shaping how communities understood both authority and continuity without ever needing to name them directly. As these roles became more familiar, a gentle differentiation settled across communal life. Certain individuals were sought out more often for guidance, not because they claimed special insight, but because their presence steadied others. They remembered agreements, mediated disputes, and preserved the balance between groups whose interests occasionally diverged. Their influence was exercised through patience and recall, through the careful weighing of precedent rather than decisive command. In this way, social order developed without sharp edges, shaped by continuity rather than enforcement. Belief and authority slowly intertwined through these figures. Because they carried memory, they also carried responsibility for ritual timing and observance. They knew when a marker needed renewal, when a path required clearing, and when a season's turning called for acknowledgement. These acts were not framed as sacred duties set apart from ordinary life. They were practical extensions of care, ensuring that the rhythms connecting living and dead remained intact. Through repetition, these responsibilities accrued quiet significance. Structures associated with such roles remained modest. A shaded area near a gathering place, a cluster of stones arranged for sitting, or a sheltered fire pit used consistently for counsel became focal points. These were not monuments, but anchors, recognized through use rather than designation. Here, decisions were discussed slowly, often revisiting earlier choices to ensure alignment with long-standing practice. The pace of such deliberation reflected a belief that stability arose from patience, and that abrupt change unsettled more than it resolved. When members of these guiding roles died, remembrance extended beyond immediate kin. The community responded as a whole, marking the passing through shared labor and attention. The resting place chosen for them often lay within sight of communal paths, ensuring that daily movement would continue to intersect with memory. In passing these sites, people recalled not only the individual, but the role they had fulfilled: listening, balancing, preserving. The afterlife, in this context, became a continuation of stewardship through memory rather than action. Over time, this pattern reinforced a layered understanding of existence. Life was not experienced as a flat collection of identical roles, but as a woven fabric of differing responsibilities, all contributing to continuity. Death did not erase these distinctions. Instead, it transformed them, allowing influence to persist in quieter form. Through these practices, communities came to understand that social structure extended beyond visible participation, and that the order sustaining life was carried forward through remembrance, place, and the steady repetition of care. As these patterns matured, a quiet sense of hierarchy settled into place. not through dominance, but through accumulation of trust. The community came to recognize that certain roles carried broader responsibility for continuity itself. Those who tended memory, mediated balance, and oversaw ritual movement were understood as bridges between generations. Their presence affirmed that order did not arise spontaneously each day, but was maintained through careful attention over long spans of time. This understanding shaped how institutions emerged. They were not announced or formalized. Instead, they crystallized around repeated needs: the keeping of seasonal knowledge, the preservation of burial paths, the timing of gatherings, and the care of shared spaces gradually required consistent oversight. Individuals associated with these tasks became points of reference. Others deferred to them instinctively, not out of obligation, but because their involvement brought reassurance. Stability followed their presence, and belief followed stability. The afterlife, as imagined within this social structure, reflected these arrangements. The departed, who had served as mediators or guides, were not thought to withdraw entirely. Their influence remained accessible through the places associated with them and the practices they had upheld. In passing such sites, people felt aligned rather than supervised. Guidance persisted as atmosphere rather than instruction, shaping behavior through familiarity instead of command. Elite life, in this early sense, was not defined by separation from labor or abundance of material goods. It was defined by proximity to continuity. Those occupying central roles lived much like others, sharing the same foods and shelters. What distinguished them was attentiveness, a sustained awareness of past decisions, future needs, and the delicate balance between them. Their authority rested in memory, held carefully, and belief in their continued presence after death reinforced that authority without requiring enforcement. Over generations, this arrangement softened fear around death among those in such roles. Passing did not mean disappearance or loss of purpose. Instead, it marked a transition into another form of participation. The dead became part of the institutional memory of the community, shaping norms and expectations quietly. In this way, belief in an afterlife supported social continuity, ensuring that responsibility and order extended beyond individual lifespans. By the time these patterns were firmly established, the distinction between social life and belief had largely dissolved. Institutions were expressions of shared understanding, and belief was embedded in structure. The living moved within systems shaped by those who had gone before, and the dead remained present through the stability they had helped create. In this calm alignment of hierarchy, memory, and imagined continuity, early societies found a durable way to sustain order, allowing belief in life beyond death, to support not only personal meaning, but the quiet endurance of communal life itself. As social roles and quiet institutions settled into place, attention gradually extended beyond the immediate bounds of the community. Paths once used only for daily movement began to stretch farther, connecting distant valleys, rivers, and coastlines. With these routes came exchange, not hurried or ambitious, but steady and relational. People carried tools, stories, and customs across familiar landscapes, allowing ideas to travel alongside goods. In this widening world, beliefs about life and death were carried gently from one group to another, adapting without losing their calm core. Trade unfolded slowly, shaped by trust built over repeated encounters. Meetings occurred at known crossing points, near water or open ground, where movement naturally converged. These gatherings were modest, marked by shared meals and careful inspection of exchanged items. Alongside tools and materials, explanations and practices traveled. How the dead were placed, which direction they faced, and how paths were maintained became topics of quiet observation rather than debate. Through this process, afterlife beliefs gained breadth, informed by diverse landscapes and experiences. Movement across greater distances reinforced the idea of continuity beyond immediate presence. Travelers followed routes that extended beyond sight, trusting that familiar patterns would reappear. This experience mirrored emerging beliefs about the afterlife as a journey rather than a conclusion. The act of leaving home and returning altered but intact provided a lived analogy for the idea that departure did not equate to loss. Over time, such analogies strengthened confidence in unseen continuities. Landscapes encountered along these routes influenced belief subtly. Deserts suggested endurance through openness and restraint. Forests implied layering and return. Coastlines, where water met land and movement never ceased, offered powerful images of transition. Communities absorbed these impressions without formal synthesis. Belief adjusted naturally, accommodating new metaphors while retaining its foundation in familiar practice. As ideas circulated, certain features became shared across regions. Paths leading outward from settlements, markers placed at transitions, and modest offerings reflecting daily life appeared repeatedly in different forms. This convergence did not signal uniformity, but resonance. Separate groups recognized similar patterns because they arose from shared human experience. Through movement and exchange, belief in an afterlife grew, not as a doctrine imposed from above, but as a quiet consensus shaped by many lives, many journeys, and the steady expansion of the known world. As these exchanges continued, the movement of ideas became as important as the movement of goods. Travelers carried with them not only materials shaped by distant hands, but habits of thought shaped by other landscapes. A resting place seen beside a foreign river, a marker placed at the edge of a high pass, or a ritual pause observed before entering unfamiliar ground all lingered in memory. Upon returning home, these impressions softened local practice, adding nuance without disruption. Belief expanded through quiet comparison rather than replacement. Technology, too, played a gentle role in this expansion. Improvements in tools and transport allowed people to move with greater confidence across longer distances. Boats followed coastlines and rivers with steady rhythm, guided by stars that returned predictably to their positions. These journeys reinforced trust in invisible order. Navigation relied on patterns that could not be grasped directly, only learned through observation and patience. In this reliance, travelers experienced a daily affirmation that unseen structures governed movement and return. The afterlife, imagined as a guided passage, fit naturally within this worldview. Economic rhythms shaped belief in subtler ways. Surplus, when it appeared, was stored or shared rather than hoarded. Granaries and communal stores became symbols of deferred continuity, holding sustenance beyond immediate need. The idea that nourishment could be preserved for a future moment mirrored the belief that care could extend beyond a single lifespan. Objects placed with the dead reflected this understanding. simple provisions meant to support continuity rather than display wealth. Material culture thus echoed philosophical orientation, reinforcing belief through use rather than statement. Philosophical reflection, though never abstracted into formal systems, emerged through repeated observation. People noted that actions taken with care tended to yield steadier outcomes over time. Patience preserved resources, memory preserved knowledge, and attention preserved balance. From this, an implicit understanding arose that continuity depended on sustained effort across generations. The afterlife became one expression of this broader principle, representing the extension of responsibility and presence beyond immediate visibility. Landscape itself remained the constant teacher. Mountains demonstrated endurance, plains suggested openness, and seas embodied perpetual movement. Communities living near each of these environments adapted belief accordingly, imagining the afterlife through the metaphors most familiar to them. Yet beneath these variations lay a shared structure. Life moved onward, guided by patterns that outlasted individual existence. Through trade, technology, and philosophy, grounded in experience, belief matured into a flexible framework capable of absorbing change while preserving its quiet assurance. As these wider connections settled into routine, belief continued to deepen through accumulation rather than declaration. No single route, object, or story defined the afterlife. Instead, meaning emerged from the overlap of many small experiences, each reinforcing the sense that continuity was natural and dependable. The repetition of travel, exchange, and return made absence feel provisional rather than final. What moved away often came back changed, but recognizable, and this pattern shaped how death itself was understood. Over long periods, communities began to perceive themselves as part of broader human movement, rather than isolated groups bound only to local ground. Ancestry extended outward as well as backward, linked through shared practices encountered across distances. The dead, imagined as travelers along unseen paths, fit easily into this widening view. They were not confined to a single resting place, but associated with routes, exchanges, and the quiet spread of influence. Memory, like trade, crossed boundaries without force. Belief also adapted to periods of change. When landscapes altered through climate or movement, older resting places were sometimes left behind, yet the idea of continuity persisted. New paths were marked, new markers raised, and familiar gestures repeated in altered settings. This adaptability reinforced confidence that belief did not depend on fixed geography. The afterlife was portable, carried within practice and orientation, rather than bound to a single site. In this way, continuity survived disruption without losing coherence. The gradual sophistication of tools and systems did not displace earlier understandings. Instead, they layered upon them. As people learned to plan farther ahead, to store resources across seasons, and to coordinate activity among larger groups, the idea of extended existence felt increasingly intuitive. Life already required attention beyond the present moment. Death, then, became another horizon rather than an ending. The future included the unseen just as naturally as it included the unborn. By the close of this expansion, belief in the afterlife had become inseparable from the human experience of movement and connection. Trade routes, seasonal migrations, and shared practices formed a living network through which ideas flowed quietly. The afterlife was understood as part of this same network, a continuation along paths shaped by care, memory, and orientation. Through gradual expansion rather than revelation, early humans integrated belief into the widening world, ensuring that even as horizons extended, continuity remained at the center of how life and death were understood. As these long developments settled into place, belief no longer felt like a separate idea held alongside daily life. It became an atmosphere, shaped by countless small acts repeated across generations. The quiet care shown to paths, markers, and memories had taught communities how to live with continuity as a guiding principle. From this accumulated understanding emerged a broader reflection, one that did not seek explanation so much as recognition. Human life, viewed across many lifetimes, revealed a steady pattern of arrival, movement, and departure. Each person entered a world already shaped by others and moved within structures they did not create alone. Tools bore the marks of many hands, paths were worn by countless feet, and stories carried layers of retelling. Within this shared inheritance, individual lives appeared as brief but meaningful passages. Death, seen through this lens, was not an interruption of the pattern, but one of its essential movements. The afterlife, as imagined through tombs and ghost paths, mirrored this broader rhythm. It was not a destination sharply defined, but a continuation of participation in quieter form. The dead were present in the steadiness of roots, the persistence of customs, and the calm authority of memory. Their influence flowed forward without visibility, shaping behavior and expectation through familiarity rather than command. In this way, belief offered reassurance, not by promising certainty, but by affirming connection. This understanding softened the boundaries of time. Past and present were not separated by clear lines, but overlapped through place and practice. Standing near a resting site or walking a long-used path allowed multiple moments to coexist. Memory moved freely, unconfined by chronology. Within this fluid sense of time, the future also took on depth. Life extended beyond the immediate horizon, carried by the knowledge that what was tended carefully would endure. Such reflection did not arise from philosophical abstraction. It emerged from living attentively within a world that constantly demonstrated continuity. Seasons returned, stars reappeared, and paths remained even as travelers changed. These observations formed a quiet education, teaching that stability was achieved through patience and care rather than control. The belief in an afterlife became one expression of this lesson, offering a way to hold loss without rupture. Through this perspective, human existence was understood as a series of gentle transitions rather than absolute states. Birth, life, death, and remembrance formed a continuous arc, each phase connected by shared responsibility. The afterlife, then, was not distant or removed. It was woven into the same fabric that held daily life together, affirming that presence could persist beyond visibility, and that continuity, once established, could carry meaning across time without needing to be named or defended. Within this extended view, the individual self softened its edges. Identity was no longer held entirely within the boundaries of a single body or a single span of years. It stretched outward into relationships, into the land shaped by repeated care, and into the habits preserved through imitation. A person's presence lingered in the way a tool was held, in the choice of a path at a familiar crossing, in the pause taken before leaving a resting place behind. These traces required no effort to maintain. They persisted because they were useful, because they continued to serve life as it moved forward. Memory, in this sense, was not a record stored apart from experience. It was an active force, shaping perception and action without announcing itself. The living did not need to recall the dead deliberately in order to feel their influence. It emerged naturally during work, travel, and rest, embedded in the very structure of daily movement. Through this constant understated presence, the idea of an afterlife gained substance. Continuation did not depend on belief alone. It was observed in effect. This perspective also altered how uncertainty was held. Because continuity was experienced rather than imagined, the unknown carried less weight. What lay beyond death did not need to be described precisely. It was enough to know that transition was part of a larger pattern already visible everywhere else. The same patience that guided planting and harvesting, building and repair, could be extended toward the unseen. In this way, belief functioned less as explanation and more as alignment, bringing human understanding into harmony with observed rhythms. Over long periods, this alignment encouraged restraint. Excessive display, rigid certainty, or forceful assertion found little place within such a worldview. Stability arose from moderation, from action scaled to endurance rather than immediacy. The afterlife, imagined within this framework, reflected similar values. It was calm, gradual, and continuous, shaped by care rather than judgment. This vision supported social balance by reinforcing the idea that influence persisted only through responsibility and attention, not through domination. In moments of loss, this understanding offered quiet support. Grief was not erased, but it was held within a broader context. Absence did not imply severance. The departed were understood to have shifted position within the shared pattern, no longer acting directly, but continuing to shape the world through what they had helped establish. This allowed sorrow to coexist with steadiness, preserving motion without denying feeling. Through these reflections, the belief in an afterlife revealed its deeper function. It provided a way to remain oriented within a world defined by change. By recognizing continuity beyond visibility, early humans found a means to sustain care, memory, and responsibility across generations. The afterlife became not an escape from life, but a quiet affirmation of its enduring structure, ensuring that even as individuals passed, the patterns that held them would remain. As this long understanding reached its natural close, reflection settled into stillness rather than conclusion. The belief in life beyond death did not resolve every uncertainty, nor did it promise final answers. Instead, it offered a way of remaining gently oriented within a world that was always in motion. The quiet assurance that continuity endured allowed attention to rest on care rather than control, on patience rather than urgency. Across countless generations, humans learned that what endured was not the individual moment, but the pattern formed through repeated, attentive living. Paths remained because they were walked. Memory persisted because it was woven into action. Meaning survived because it was shared without insistence. In this slow accumulation, death came to be understood not as a rupture, but as a change in position within the same ongoing design. The dead did not vanish. They settled into the background of life, shaping it through presence that no longer required visibility. The land itself became a companion in this understanding. It held markers without judgment, carried paths without question, and accepted both growth and decay with equal calm. In walking across it, humans sensed their own place within a wider continuity that extended far beyond a single lifespan. Tombs and ghost paths were not monuments to loss, but quiet acknowledgments of movement, of life traveling onward along routes that had always existed, whether seen or unseen. Over time, this perspective softened the human relationship with endings. Departure was met with care, memory was sustained through habit, and the future was approached with steadiness rather than fear. The belief in an afterlife did not stand apart from daily life. It arose directly from it, shaped by the same rhythms that governed waking and rest, labor and pause, presence and absence. In this calm alignment, the story of afterlives found its resting place, not as doctrine or promise, but as an atmosphere, an enduring sense that nothing truly meaningful was ever lost, only transformed. Life continued in quieter forms, carried forward through paths, walked gently, memories held lightly, and a shared understanding that existence, once set in motion, did not simply end, but moved on, steadily and without haste, beyond the edge of sight. And so, the long human habit of imagining what lies beyond death settled into silence, into earth and path and memory. The world continued to turn, the land remained patient, and life moved onward in its unbroken rhythm, carrying both the living and the departed within the same quiet, enduring flow.